The paradox of the perfect mirror is a fascinating enigma that invites us to question the nature of reality and the way we reflect ourselves in the world. Imagine a mirror so flawless, so absolutely perfect, that it not only reflects every detail with millimetric precision, but also introduces no distortion and no imperfection in the image. In this scenario, the image you see in the mirror is identical to reality. And yet, when you look at yourself, you are confronted with an unsuspected contradiction. The mirror, by reflecting you exactly, becomes an exact copy of you, but at the same time, it is an inverted representation of your being. This inversion, which affects laterality, where right becomes left and vice versa, raises the question of whether it is possible to have a perfect duplication of oneself that, despite being identical in appearance, hides an inverted symmetry that essentially challenges the idea of originality and duplication. The paradox deepens when considering that, in theory, a perfect mirror should be capable of capturing not only your external image, but also the essence of your existence, your emotions, thoughts, and the complexity of your personality. But how is it possible for an inanimate surface to reproduce something so dynamic and ever-changing? In that sense, the perfect mirror presents itself as a metaphor for the complexity of the self. It shows us an image that is simultaneously faithful and altered, a duality that reflects the way we perceive our own being. It is as if the mirror not only duplicated what we are, but also, in that act of duplication, revealed the possibility of an alternate self, a version that exists in a state of perfect symmetry, but that at the same time is unattainable, because being reflected, it remains on the other side of the surface. The paradox of the perfect mirror leads us to question concepts as fundamental as identity and authenticity. When we look at ourselves in the mirror, we expect to see ourselves as we are, but the inversion and duplication force us to recognize that the image is, in a certain sense, a representation mediated by the laws of optics, a reflection that shows us an altered reality. This phenomenon makes us think about the ephemeral and subjective nature of perception, since what we believe to be ourself is in reality a construction based on the information we receive through our senses, information that can be transformed, distorted, or inverted by the way we interact with the world. Thus, the perfect mirror becomes a symbol of the limitation of our methods for capturing the complete essence of reality and of ourselves, revealing that apparent perfection hides a paradox in which the ideal copy and the original merge into a single entity that challenges traditional logic. This idea becomes especially intriguing when it is extended to reflection on the possibility of creating exact replicas in other fields, such as cloning or the digital transfer of consciousness. If one day we manage to recreate the human being in its entirety, will that replica be a perfect copy? As in the case of the mirror, will it present an inversion or a subtle alteration that makes it different from the original? The paradox of the perfect mirror, therefore, invites us to explore the limits of duplication and authenticity, questioning whether it is possible to achieve a reproduction so exact that the essence of being is preserved without any kind of change, or whether the very nature of the replication process always entails an inherent transformation that leads us to reflect on true identity. In the end, the paradox of the perfect mirror stands as a profound reflection on perception, identity, and reality. It challenges us to consider that, although we may long for an ideal copy of ourselves or of our environment, the very nature of existence implies a mixture of the original and the reflected, of the faithful and the inverted. It is a reminder that absolute perfection may in fact be an illusion that confronts us with the complexity and ambiguity of who we are and of the world around us, opening the door to an endless exploration of the mysteries hidden behind every reflection, every image, and every representation of reality. The paradox of inevitable success refers to that strange situation in which achieving success, instead of being the ultimate goal and a state of complete satisfaction, becomes the beginning of new challenges and pressures that can sometimes cause success itself to turn into a burden. Imagine someone who has reached an exceptional level in their career or venture. After receiving recognition, fame, and perhaps a considerable fortune, they suddenly find themselves trapped in a whirlwind of relentless expectations, constant criticism, and the pressure to maintain and even surpass what has been achieved. That person, who initially enjoyed the fruits of their effort, begins to feel that success itself demands a perfection that paradoxically limits their freedom to experiment, take risks, and ultimately grow in a natural way. This contradiction is what many call the paradox of inevitable success. When we achieve success, the world watches us, and expectations become so high that any mistake or setback is magnified. The admiration that once pushed us to strive transforms into constant scrutiny, a pressure that forces us to maintain an impeccable image. In this way, success can become so overwhelming that it prevents us from innovating or exploring new paths, since the fear of disappointing others or of losing what was so hard to achieve paralyzes us. In addition, success attracts both praise and envy, and at times, criticism becomes a force that undermines confidence and creativity, turning what seemed like a triumph into a source of anxiety and stress. Thus, instead of enjoying the freedom and satisfaction one expects after success, it feels as though every step forward is accompanied by an invisible weight that complicates the journey. This paradox extends not only at an individual level, but also in the realm of organizations and societies. A company that achieves resounding success in the market may find itself facing the threat of disruptive innovation, where emerging competitors take advantage of the rigidity and complacency that often accompany success to gain ground. Likewise, a country that has experienced notable economic growth may fall into the trap of conservative policies that resist change, which in the long term can prevent adaptation to new global challenges. The paradox of inevitable success reminds us that achieving extraordinary goals is not an endpoint, but the beginning of a new stage in which the ability to reinvent oneself and evolve is essential to maintain relevance and prosperity. The key to confronting this paradox lies in redefining what we understand by success. Instead of seeing it as a final state of perfection, it is useful to consider it as a continuous process of learning and adaptation, where each achievement opens the door to new challenges and opportunities. Resilience, humility, and the ability to take risks are essential qualities for transforming the pressure of success into the force that drives new innovations and personal improvements. For example, in the professional sphere, instead of resting on one's laurels after reaching a goal, it is important to remain in constant search of new ideas, learn from mistakes, and be willing to reinvent oneself in the face of changes in the environment. In this way, success becomes a springboard for continuous growth rather than a trap that limits personal evolution. This paradox also has a profound impact on the way we relate to others. Success, when achieved in an evident way, can alter the dynamics of our relationships by generating envy, rivalries, or even emotional disconnection. The pressure to maintain a successful image can lead relationships to be based on superficial admiration and constant competition, rather than on authenticity and mutual support. For this reason, It is essential to cultivate a balanced perspective in which the path traveled is valued and it is recognized that success is only one part of a life, rich in experiences, learning, and meaningful relationships. By adopting an attitude that acknowledges both achievements and setbacks, the inevitable pressure of success can be transformed into a source of motivation to continue exploring, innovating, and growing. Ultimately, the paradox of inevitable success is a reminder that in the journey of life, every triumph comes accompanied by new challenges that require adaptability and a constant reevaluation of our goals. Success, far from being a final destination, is a dynamic process that, if not managed with intelligence and humility, can become a burden that limits our capacity to evolve. Learning to enjoy the journey, to accept the ups and downs, and to see every experience as an opportunity to grow is essential to turn success into a positive force that drives us to achieve new goals without losing sight of what truly matters: authenticity, learning, and connection with others. Thus, the paradox of inevitable success invites us to reflect on the true meaning of achievement, reminding us that greatness does not lie in reaching a fixed point of perfection, but in the continuous challenge of surpassing ourselves while enjoying every step along the path toward a future full of possibilities. The paradox of the subjective observer is an enigma that invites us to question the way we perceive reality and how our own existence influences what we observe. Imagine that every time you look at the world, you do not do so in a neutral way, but rather your mind, with all its beliefs, emotions, and personal experiences, colors and transforms that vision. That is to say, the reality you see is inextricably linked to you, to your way of interpreting your surroundings, which creates a fascinating contradiction. How is it possible to obtain an objective image of the world if the observer always acts from a subjective perspective? This paradox suggests that there is no universal truth independent of the one who perceives it, since every experience is unique and is mediated by the emotional state, expectations, and personal history of each individual. When someone observes an event, they do not only register what happens, but also filter it through their own memories and emotions, creating a version of reality that, although real for that person, may differ radically from that of another. This phenomenon becomes evident in everyday situations. Two people can witness the same event, but describe it in completely different ways due to the influence of their past experiences and their beliefs about the world. The paradox of the subjective observer leads us to reflect on the nature of objectivity and knowledge, since it calls into question the idea that we can know the world as it is without interference from our own being. In the field of science, this issue is especially relevant, since the process of observation can alter what is being measured. For example, in quantum mechanics, the act of observing a system can change its state, a phenomenon known as the collapse of the wave function, which demonstrates that the intervention of the observer is inherent to the measurement process. This effect, which seems to contradict classical logic, suggests that reality is not completely defined until it is observed, which makes the subjectivity of the observer a fundamental part of existence itself. In simple terms, every time we try to understand something, our mind cannot avoid injecting a bit of ourselves into the description, and that personal touch, although enriching, also prevents us from achieving a purely objective view. This paradox has profound implications for how we interpret human knowledge, since it implies that truth is to a certain extent relative, and that what we consider real is a construction that varies according to the observer. This does not mean that everything is arbitrary, but rather that human experience and individual perception play a crucial role in the way our world is constructed. The paradox of the subjective observer invites us to accept that the search for objectivity may be an endless task, in which we will always have to deal with the influence of our own minds, and that the diversity of perspectives is, in fact, one of the riches of human experience. By understanding that our view of the world is only one among many, we can learn to value differences and to be open to new interpretations that enrich us and help us see reality from multiple angles. This idea, far from being an obstacle, can be a source of creativity and empathy, since by recognizing the inherent subjectivity in each observer, we become more aware of our limitations and, at the same time, more receptive to understanding the visions of others. The paradox of the subjective observer, therefore, is an invitation to explore not only the external world, but also the inner recesses of our own mind, in a journey in which reflection and self-awareness become tools for approaching a more complete and richer understanding of reality. The paradox of modified memory is an enigma that invites us to question the truthfulness of our memories and the very nature of human experience. Imagine that every time you try to remember an important event, your mind does not simply reproduce a static image of the past, but subtly transforms it by altering it. This phenomenon, in which memory changes over time, seems to contradict the idea that what we have lived is preserved intact within us. However, science has shown that our memories are in fact dynamic and malleable processes. Every time we remember, our brain reconstructs the experience from scattered fragments, and in that act of reconstruction, errors or distortions can be introduced, influenced by our emotions, beliefs, and the context in which the memory occurs. Thus, what at first we consider a faithful copy of an event gradually becomes a modified version that can vary from one occasion to another. This paradox becomes even more intriguing when we consider the influence that external suggestions, the media, or even conversations with others have on the way we remember. For example, after reading an article or watching a movie based on real events, our memories of those events may change, adapting to the new information and acquiring details that were not previously present. In this way, memory becomes a collaborative process in which interaction with the environment and social influence play a fundamental role. The paradox of modified memory challenges us to trust what we believe we remember, since each recollection may be the result of a mixture of what actually happened and the reinterpretations we have accumulated over time. It is as if our past were always under construction, subject to the constant revision of our mind, which raises questions about the authenticity of our experiences and the reliability of memory as a faithful record of time. What makes this phenomenon especially fascinating is that despite its limitations, our memory continues to be the foundation of our identity. Memories, even those that have been modified, shape the narrative that defines us and connects us with our environment and with others. The ability to rewrite our memories, although it may seem like a weakness, also allows us to adapt and learn from past experiences, continuously updating our perception of reality. This dynamic process, which can sometimes lead to misunderstandings or the creation of false memories, is also a survival tool, since it allows us to reinterpret and adjust our reactions to new situations. The paradox of modified memory, therefore, is a demonstration of the complexity of the human mind, which does not store data like an immutable archive, but instead constantly transforms it by filtering it through our emotions and lived experiences. In a world in which technology is beginning to directly influence the way we store and access information, the idea that our memory can be modified takes on new dimensions. With the rise of social media, algorithms, and artificial intelligence, the information we consume and share is subject to manipulations that can influence our personal memories. Every time we interact with digital media, we are exposed to interpretations and narratives that can reconfigure the way we remember crucial events. adding an additional layer of complexity to the paradox of modified memory. The integration of external data with our internal memories raises ethical and philosophical challenges. To what extent can we trust our own memories if they are constantly being shaped by external sources? Is it possible to recover a pure past without the interference of digital information? These questions force us to reflect on the value of truth and authenticity in a world where memory can be edited almost as easily as an online post is updated. This paradox, far from being just a scientific curiosity, has profound implications in fields as varied as justice, psychology, and history. In the legal field, for example, the mutability of memory can influence witness testimony and the interpretation of facts, which has led to a rethinking of how evidence is collected and evaluated in a trial. In psychology, understanding the mutable nature of memory makes it possible to develop therapies that help people overcome trauma by reconfiguring their memories in ways that reduce emotional suffering. In history, the reconstruction of the past from accounts and documents will always be subject to the subjectivity of those who lived it or recorded it, reminding us that the narrative of humanity is largely a construction in constant evolution. The paradox of modified memory teaches us that although we seek stability and certainty in our memories, the human mind is an entity in constant change, adapting to new experiences and reinterpreting the past in ways that sometimes escape our control. This continuous transformation is not necessarily negative, but rather reflects the inherent capacity of the mind to evolve and grow by integrating lived experiences in a way that allows us to move forward. In the end, this paradox invites us to embrace the uncertainty and fluidity of our existence, recognizing that the reality we remember is as alive and changing as we are ourselves. Every time we recall a memory, we do not simply bring the past back, but reinvent it, adding new layers of meaning that enrich our identity and prepare us to face the future with a broader and more compassionate perspective. The paradox of historical distortion invites us to reflect on how the passage of time can subtly and sometimes radically alter our understanding of the past, creating a gap between what actually happened and what we remember or recount. Imagine that each generation receives a version of history that, although based on real events, has been shaped by interests, emotions, and prejudices, so that what is passed down gradually moves further away from the original reality. This transformation can occur intentionally or unintentionally. On the one hand, there are forces that seek to rewrite history to fit political or ideological narratives. On the other, the simple process of collective memory, which tends to simplify, embellish, or even distort events, causes details to be lost or modified over time. The phenomenon becomes evident in countless examples throughout the centuries, where heroic accounts turn into myths, tragic events are softened or ignored, and historical figures acquire characteristics that respond more to the expectations of contemporary society than to the reality of their own time. For example, the image of certain leaders may be exalted as a symbol of virtue and sacrifice, while their mistakes or ambitions are minimized or completely forgotten. This paradox presents itself as a puzzle in which, on one hand, history seeks to preserve truth through documents, testimonies, and records, and on the other, the narrative becomes a living entity modified by the perception, emotions, and interests of those who transmit it. Historical distortion becomes even more complex when it is mixed with technology and the media, which, in the digital age, allows certain narratives to spread rapidly and adapt to new currents of thought, sometimes without the necessary verification of facts. Social networks and digital platforms can act as amplifiers of partial or even erroneous versions of history, shaping collective memory in such a way that what was once a precise event becomes a variable interpretation subject to the influence of opinion trends and deliberate manipulation. Thus, what was initially recorded with objectivity in archives and testimonies gradually turns into a flexible narrative in which each new account adds a layer of interpretation that can distort the original image. This paradox challenges us to think of history as a dynamic process in which truth is not a fixed concept, but a mosaic of perspectives that are reconfigured over time. By recognizing that our view of the past is conditioned by the present, we realize that history is as alive as the societies that tell it, and that each generation has the responsibility to question, investigate, and reconstruct the historical narrative in a critical way. This exercise is not only necessary to better understand our origins and evolution, but is also essential to prevent the repetition of past mistakes, since a distorted memory can lead to misguided interpretations and decisions based on myths rather than facts. In summary, the paradox of historical distortion reminds us that the truth of the past is an ideal always under construction, and that history, far from being an immutable account, is a battleground where interests, emotions, and memories converge. This reality pushes us to maintain a critical and open attitude, to seek evidence, and to be willing to revise our ideas about what happened, so that, despite inevitable transformations, we can come as close as possible to an honest and profound understanding of our collective legacy. Every time we study history, we not only look backward, but also face the task of discerning between what was told and what actually occurred, recognizing that the historical narrative is, ultimately, an imperfect mirror of reality. The paradox of technological progress is a fascinating reflection on how, as we develop tools and systems to improve our lives, we simultaneously become increasingly dependent on them, questioning whether we are truly moving toward freedom or, on the contrary, falling into a kind of digital enslavement. In a world where technology has become the engine of modernity, it is undeniable that advances have enabled remarkable achievements, from the automation of everyday tasks to global interconnection that allows us to communicate instantly with people anywhere on the planet. However, as we benefit from these advances, profound dilemmas emerge regarding autonomy and the loss of control. For example, while artificial intelligences and algorithms make our daily lives easier by managing everything from traffic to our personal finances, they also create a dependency that can limit our ability to make decisions independently. Each new application and every smart device not only simplifies our activities, but also ties us to a system in which information, control, and data management are concentrated in the hands of large corporations and governments, raising questions about privacy and individual freedom. This duality is evident in the use of social networks, where technology connects and informs us, but at the same time conditions us to live under the influence of algorithms that decide what information we see and whom we consider important, shaping our opinions and behaviors in ways that often go unnoticed. The comfort and efficiency that technology offers can, without us realizing it, turn into a kind of invisible cage that limits our human interactions and reduces our ability to act critically toward our environment. In this context, technological progress appears as a double-edged sword. On one hand, it is the tool that drives development, innovation, and social advancement. On the other, it can lead us into a situation in which we depend so heavily on machines that our own ability to solve problems is diminished. Automation and digitalization have eliminated many barriers, and made it possible for tasks once considered impossible to be completed in a matter of seconds. However, this efficiency can also result in job losses and in the decline of skills that were passed down from generation to generation, creating a gap between those who master technology and those who are left behind, thereby increasing social inequalities. In addition, technological dependence exposes us to risks such as cyber attacks, failures in critical systems, and the possibility of centralized control that limits diversity of thought. Every technological advance, no matter how beneficial it may seem, comes with an invisible cost: the weakening of our autonomy and the possibility that our decisions are increasingly influenced by automated systems. The paradox deepens when we consider that in the pursuit of solving complex problems and improving quality of life, we tend to forget that technology is created by us and for us, and that its design and operation reflect the values and priorities of those who develop it. This realization invites us to ask whether we are moving toward a society in which human beings reclaim control of their destiny, or whether, instead, we surrender to the convenience of a progress that traps us in a web of dependencies that limit our freedom and creativity. Ultimately, the paradox of technological progress challenges us to find a balance between taking advantage of the benefits of innovation and maintaining our ability to decide and act independently. It is a call to reflect on the direction we are taking as a society, to question the ethical and social implications of each advance, and to work towards systems that, rather than enslaving us, empower us and allow us to live in harmony with technology. The challenge is great, but recognizing this paradox is the first step toward building a future in which progress becomes a tool for liberation and the integral development of the human being, rather than a source of new limitations. The paradox of infinite innovation leads us to reflect on how every new idea, every discovery, or technological advance seems to be built upon the foundations of previous ideas, creating an endless chain of inspiration and improvement. If everything that emerges is based on what already existed, how did the first idea originate? This question challenges us to think about the starting point of human creativity and the mystery surrounding the emergence of original thought. Imagine a scenario in which knowledge is built like a never-ending building, where each floor rests on the one below it, allowing ideas to evolve and transform over time. In this process, every new conception is nourished by the experiences, observations, and ideas that came before it, making the act of innovating seem like a cumulative process with no clear point of origin. However, the paradox indicates that for this uninterrupted chain of ideas to exist, there must have been a first link, an initial spark that gave rise to the entire evolution of thought and culture. A simple way to understand this paradox is to imagine creativity as a river that flows endlessly. Each drop of water represents an idea that has been influenced by the currents and whirlpools of the river before it. The river, in its vastness, is formed from small tributaries that at some point come together and create a powerful current. But if you ask where those first tributaries come from, you are confronted with the question of their origin. Similarly, in innovation, the ideas we have today are so interconnected with those of the past that it is almost impossible to point to a first original thought. This leads us to consider that perhaps the concept of first is a construction of our linear mind, a way of organizing time that does not necessarily reflect the chaotic and sometimes circular nature of the creative process. One possible explanation is that the first idea did not arise from nothing, but from a combination of sensory experiences, emotions, and simple observations of the world. Human beings have been exposed to nature and life since time immemorial, and it is likely that our ancestors by observing natural phenomena such as the sun, the rain, or the cycle of the seasons, began to formulate basic concepts about the world around them. These seemingly simple observations became the first ideas, the foundation upon which more complex knowledge was built over millennia. That is, the first idea may have been something as elementary as the understanding that certain events repeat themselves, or that there is a cause and an effect in nature, which laid the groundwork for the development of logical and scientific thought. Another interesting point is that innovation is not an isolated process. It is nourished by the interaction between the individual and their environment. Creativity arises from necessity, curiosity, and the search for meaning. In early times, when human beings struggled to survive, the invention of tools, the creation of fire, and the development of forms of communication were direct responses to practical challenges. These solutions, although rudimentary, represented the first innovative leaps, and each one was based on observation and adaptation of what nature already offered. Thus, the innovative process is both a response to immediate needs and a gradual evolution of accumulated thought, where each small advance opens the door to new discoveries. The paradox of infinite innovation also leads us to question how we define originality. If all ideas derive from others, then creativity is a continuous cycle in which novelty emerges from the reconfiguration of existing elements. In this sense, originality does not mean creating something completely new, but rather seeing old ideas from a different perspective, combining them in unexpected ways that open new paths. It is possible that the first idea was not revolutionary in itself, but rather a simple observation or intuition that later transformed and expanded through generations of human thought. Finally, it is important to recognize that the paradox of the origin of innovation invites us to embrace the complexity of the creative process rather than seek simplistic answers. The history of human knowledge is a mosaic of influences, inspirations, and adaptations that constantly feed back into one another. Every new idea is a link in a chain that stretches across history, and trying to identify a single beginning may be as unattainable as pointing to the first grain of sand on an endless beach. What truly matters is the process itself, the human capacity to observe, reflect, and transform reality, creating a future in which innovation continues to be the force that drives progress, despite the paradoxes that arise when we try to understand its deepest origin. The paradox of the perfect simulator is an enigma that invites us to question the very nature of what we consider real. Imagine a scenario in which all the reality we perceive, every detail, every sensation, every thought, is the product of a simulation so flawless that no one, not even the most perceptive scientists, could distinguish it from what we call reality. If every sound, every image, and every emotion were generated by a simulation system that functions perfectly, what difference would there be between living in that simulated world and inhabiting a real universe? This question leads us to reflect on the essence of experience and on the role of perception in the construction of our existence. The idea is based on the fact that reality is largely a construction of our mind. What we see, hear, and feel is interpreted and organized by our brain. If that brain were to receive data from a simulation so detailed that it replicated every aspect of the physical world, then the line between the simulated and the real would become completely blurred. The paradox of the perfect simulator challenges us to think about the possibility that, instead of there being an objective and tangible universe, our experience of life is simply the result of a complex program that imitates reality perfectly. In this sense, the simulation would not only contain an exact reproduction of matter and energy, but also of the emotional, cultural, and social processes that shape our daily lives. Every interaction, every memory, and every emotion would be generated artificially. But if the experience is indistinguishable from the one we obtain in reality, how could we know the true nature of our environment? This uncertainty opens a profound field of philosophical reflection. Does a real difference truly exist between a simulated universe and one that exists naturally? If both produce the same sensory and emotional experience, the paradox leads us to ask whether the authenticity of experience depends on its origin or on the way it is lived. It is possible that in the end, what truly matters is not whether the world is simulated or not, but whether we live or not, but the quality of the experience we obtain from it. The illusion of separation between the simulated and the real dissolves when we recognize that in both cases, the essence of human experience is based on how we interpret and value what we perceive. If the simulation is perfect, our emotions, relationships, and learning would develop in the same way they do in what we traditionally call reality, turning the discussion about authenticity into a debate about the nature of knowledge and perception. This idea also raises questions about freedom and control. Would we truly be living an authentic life if everything, from our thoughts to our actions, were predetermined by a simulation algorithm? Or does true freedom reside in the way we experience the world, regardless of its origin? Ultimately, the paradox of the perfect simulator challenges us to consider that the essence of life and human experience may be so complex and wonderful that it does not require a real foundation in the traditional sense to have meaning. What truly matters is the connection with our emotions, the way we interact with others, and the manner in which we find meaning in the apparent chaos of the universe. Thus, this paradox not only calls into question our understanding of reality, but also invites us to appreciate the beauty of mystery and to recognize that perhaps what is most valuable is not the source of our experiences, but their quality and depth. Every reflection on the origin of what we perceive brings us closer to understanding that the true essence of existence lies in the way we live and feel, beyond whether that world is generated by nature or by a perfect simulator. The paradox of autonomous thought invites us to question the true originality of our ideas, since it seems that every thought is inevitably influenced by prior experiences, learning, and cultural contexts. If everything we conceive is shaped by what we have already lived and absorbed from our environment, is it possible for a completely original idea to ever arise without any trace of what came before us? This question leads us to explore the complexity of the human mind and the creative process, which, at first glance, might appear to be a continuous flow of imitations and adaptations, but which in reality is a dynamic and surprisingly profound process. Every time we think, our brain connects accumulated information, emotions, perceptions, and memories, generating responses that may seem new but are the result of an intricate network of past influences. This interconnection poses a dilemma. If our ideas are always the product of a synthesis of previous experiences, how do we define what is truly innovative? To understand this paradox, it is useful to imagine the mind as a vast fabric in which each thread represents an experience, a piece of knowledge, or a memory. When a thought arises, the brain weaves these threads together to form an image or an idea. In that sense, what we consider original is actually a new configuration of existing elements, a unique reorganization that, although novel in its form, remains deeply rooted in the past. For example, an artist may create a work that appears revolutionary, but in reality is combining techniques, styles, and influences that they have observed throughout their life. In this way, originality does not mean inventing something from scratch, but finding new ways to connect the dots between previous experiences. Thus, creativity becomes a process of recombination, where ingenuity lies in the ability to see unexpected connections between ideas that initially seem unrelated. This reflection also leads us to consider the role of education, culture, and society in the formation of thought. From a very young age, we are immersed in an environment that gives us guidelines on how to think, what to value, and how to interpret the world. The influence of our teachers, family members, media, and friends shapes a foundation upon which our ideas develop. Therefore, even moments of illumination seem to be the result of the accumulation of everything we have learned, filtered through our emotions and personal experiences. However, this dependence should not be seen as an absolute limitation, but rather as an intrinsic characteristic of the human condition. Genuine creativity can arise precisely from this mixture, by combining elements of our past in unusual ways, giving rise to innovations that surprise us with their originality. It is in this process of reconfiguration that the true essence of creativity is found, since the value of an idea lies in its ability to offer new perspectives and solutions, even if it is formed from pieces that are already known. The paradox of autonomous thought ultimately challenges us to redefine what we understand by original. Perhaps originality is not the total absence of influences, but the ability to transform those influences into something that contributes new meaning or function. Every idea, no matter how influenced it may be by the past, has the potential to be revolutionary if it is capable of connecting concepts in unexpected and effective ways. In this sense, creativity is both a reflection of our personal and collective history, and a force that drives change and innovation. Although we may never be able to completely escape the traces of what we have lived, the human capacity to imagine, recombine, and reinvent remains an inexhaustible source of progress. The paradox reminds us that the creative process is itself a manifestation of the continuity of human experience, where the past and the present merge to give rise to a future full of possibilities. Thus, instead of seeing the influence of prior experiences as a limitation, we can recognize it as the raw material of creativity, an accumulated treasure that, when reconfigured, allows us to reach levels of innovation that transform our vision of the world and propel us toward unimagined horizons. The paradox of collective assumption invites us to reflect on how, when a large number of people believe in something, that belief can end up transforming reality in a tangible way. Imagine the value of money. It is not a physical object with intrinsic value, but rather its price and usefulness are based on the trust that society places in it. The more people believe in its validity and accept it as a means of exchange, the more real it becomes in practice. This idea extends to other areas where social constructs, norms, and collective beliefs shape our world. For example, concepts such as prestige, fame, or even certain cultural myths come to life and gain power precisely because a considerable group of people upholds them as true. If enough individuals become convinced of the truth or importance of something, that thing gains strength, influence, and in many cases, real consequences in everyday life. This paradox raises a fundamental question. Is reality itself a social construction? The answer is not as simple as it seems, because although many aspects of our experience are based on agreements and conventions, there is also a physical world that exists independently of our beliefs. However, the way we perceive and organize that world is deeply shaped by the collective mind. For example, laws, morality, and traditions, which at first glance may appear to be universal truths, are in fact the result of historical and cultural consensuses that have evolved over time. Faith in these structures allows them to function and endure, because if society were suddenly to stop believing in them, stability and social order would be threatened. In this way, collective assumption acts as an invisible glue that binds people together and establishes the foundations of our coexistence, turning abstract ideas into tangible realities. Consider also the case of the economy. Market fluctuations, inflation, and stock values are governed largely by the expectations and perceptions of investors and consumers. Belief in the success of a company or in the stability of a currency can drive or collapse entire economies, demonstrating that collective faith is not only a philosophical concept, but a practical force that influences concrete decisions. This dependence on collective belief generates a domino effect in which ideas reinforce one another. The more a belief is strengthened, the harder it becomes to question it. Therefore, it becomes an integral part of social reality. In other words, the reality we experience is woven from invisible threads of shared conviction that, when joined together, form the structure of our institutions, relationships, and ways of life. However, this same dependence can have contradictory effects. While collective assumption can drive progress and maintain order, it can also lead to resistance to change or the perpetuation of outdated ideas. When society clings to old beliefs, even if they are no longer useful or true, reality becomes distorted and innovation is hindered. For example, in certain contexts, resistance to accepting new scientific or technological paradigms can block progress because established ideas act as barriers to transformation. In this way, the paradox is revealed in the tension between the need for consensus to sustain society and the inevitable transformation brought by change and the evolution of human thought. This reflection leads us to conclude that, although many of the realities we live in are mediated by agreements and collective beliefs, we also have the capacity to question and transform those consensuses. Innovation and progress arise precisely when individuals or groups begin to challenge the established view, proposing new ways of seeing and living reality. In this sense, the paradox of collective assumption does not mean that everything is illusory or arbitrary, but rather that reality is largely the result of a dynamic process in which social consensus plays a crucial role, while still being subject to evolution and constant change. Ultimately, the paradox of collective assumption invites us to recognize that many of the things we take for granted, such as the value of money, social norms, or even our perception of success and happiness, are collective constructions sustained by shared belief. At the same time, it challenges us to think about how, through questioning and innovation, we can reshape that reality to adapt it to new needs and aspirations. The ability to shape what we believe to be real is, in the end, a manifestation of human power to create and reinvent the world, reminding us that although reality has an objective foundation, its meaning and functioning depend largely on how we build it together. The paradox of inevitable forgetting is a profound reflection on the fate of our actions and the legacy we try to leave in the world. Imagine that, no matter how hard we strive to build an indelible mark, time acts as a silent destroyer, erasing, distorting, or reconfiguring even the most significant moments of our lives. Everything we do, every idea, every achievement, and every emotion gradually fades into the vast ocean of history. Faced with this reality, an inevitable question arises. Does the pursuit of immortality through legacy make sense if, in the long run, everything will be forgotten? The answer is not simple, as it is intertwined with the complexity of the human condition and the very nature of time. Our desire to be remembered is as old as humanity itself, from cave paintings to the monumental constructions of ancient civilizations, people have tried to preserve their existence and their achievements. However, as time passes, collective memory tends to be reconfigured. Precise details of events are lost, intentions are misinterpreted, and stories are transformed into legends. This transformation may seem like a form of forgetting, but it is also a demonstration of culture's ability to reinvent itself and adapt. What was once an idea or an event becomes part of a larger narrative in which the essence is transmitted, even though exact details are lost. In this context, the pursuit of immortality through legacy is not about preserving every minute detail of our existence, but about impacting the world in such a way that, even if names and precise facts fade, the influence we generate continues to resonate in future generations. We may not be remembered in every detail, but our ideas, values, and contributions can transform into principles and teachings that guide others. For example, works of art, scientific discoveries, and philosophies that were once innovative can, through reinterpretations and adaptations, inspire new generations, even if the original memory has been lost in the mist of time. This paradox also invites us to rethink what it truly means to be remembered. Is immortality a matter of every action remaining unchanged over time? Or is it about generating a profound change that, even if transformed, leaves a mark on the way people think and live? History shows us that what often endures is not the accuracy of details, but the spirit of an idea. Great cultural and scientific revolutions have arisen from concepts that, despite being forgotten in their original form, have been revived and adapted to solve the challenges of each era. In that sense, legacy is not a static record, but a living process nourished by reinterpretation and change. Moreover, the paradox of inevitable forgetting confronts us with the duality of existence. On one hand, we are aware of our finitude and the fact that time erases our traces. On the other, despite this certainty, we find meaning and purpose in the attempt to influence the future. This struggle between forgetting and permanence is part of what makes us human. Awareness that everything will someday fade should not lead us to despair, but rather to value each action and to understand that true legacy is built through collective impact and the constant transformation of culture and knowledge. Individual memory may be fleeting, but the change we promote can generate ripples that spread and evolve, becoming part of the foundation upon which the future is built. Thus, instead of seeing inevitable forgetting as a defeat, we can understand it as a natural part of the cycle of life and human progress. The beauty of existence does not lie in the absolute immortality of every detail, but in the capacity to generate ideas and actions that reinvent themselves, influencing an ongoing dialogue between past, present, and future. The paradox of inevitable forgetting challenges us to embrace transformation and to find in every creative act the possibility of leaving a mark, even if it merges with the endless flow of time. Ultimately, the pursuit of immortality through legacy is not measured by the permanence of every word or image, but by the lasting influence our actions have on the fabric of culture and society. Every contribution, no matter how small it may seem, is a link in the chain of human evolution, a legacy in constant renewal that, despite inevitable forgetting, continues to shape the future of humanity.
The paradox of the speed of life is a fascinating mystery that invites us to reflect on the nature of time and how our perception transforms it throughout existence. When we are children, days seem endless. Each moment stretches as if time were moving slowly,
Allowing us to enjoy every detail and adventure with inexhaustible curiosity. However, as we grow older, the experience changes dramatically. Years seem to pass at a dizzying speed, and what once felt eternal fades in the blink of an eye. This feeling that time accelerates with age has puzzled philosophers, scientists, and artists for centuries, and it raises an intriguing question. Does an absolute time really exist, or is everything simply a matter of perception? From a scientific point of view, time is measured precisely using clocks and standardized units, and in that sense, it is a fixed and measurable dimension that is part of the fabric of the universe. Physics, through Einstein's theory of relativity, teaches us that time is relative and can vary depending on speed and gravitational force, but this occurs at very specific scales and conditions, far removed from our everyday experience. In contrast, the personal experience of time seems completely different. During childhood, when the mind is new and each experience is recorded intensely, each day is perceived as a long journey, filled with discoveries and learning. The brain, when faced with an unfamiliar world, processes each stimulus in great detail, and each experience becomes a vivid memory, making time seem to expand. As the years go by, routine and familiarity begin to dominate life. Each day contains many experiences similar to previous ones, which causes the brain not to perceive each moment with the same intensity. And suddenly, the days blend into one another, giving the sensation that time has accelerated. This discrepancy between the objective measurement of time and the way we feel it can be explained in part by how our brain processes and stores information. When we are young, the brain creates many unique and detailed memories, which makes it feel, when recalling those moments, as though a great amount of time has passed. As we age, novelty decreases, and many of our days become routine, generating fewer distinctive memories. This phenomenon causes us, when looking back, to perceive that time passed very quickly, since unique and memorable events become less frequent. The paradox of the speed of life, therefore, not only reflects the relativity of physical time, but also the complexity of the human mind and how it shapes our experience of the passage of time. Another way to view this paradox is to consider that as we acquire more knowledge and experience, our perception of time contracts. When everything is new, each instant is a revelation and seems to last longer. But when we have already learned the basics of life, days become predictable and speed up, because the brain does not need to process as much new information. In that sense, the feeling that time passes more quickly is a reflection of our mental evolution and of how familiarity reduces the novelty of experiences. This phenomenon may also be related to the number of responsibilities and activities we take on throughout life. When we are children, much of our time is devoted to play and exploration without worries, whereas in adulthood, time is fragmented among work, family obligations, social relationships, and other commitments, which can make us feel that the clock never stops, constantly pushing us toward the next duty. The paradox of the speed of life invites us to question whether time is ultimately something absolute or whether it depends largely on our perception. Although clocks and the laws of physics give us an objective measure, the subjective experience of time is deeply personal and varies according to our mental state, our emotions, and our circumstances. This phenomenon reminds us that reality is not only what can be measured in scientific terms, but also what is felt and experienced in everyday life. The beauty of this paradox lies in its duality. While time passes in a constant way at the physical level, our mind has the ability to expand or contract it, giving each stage of life a unique and often contradictory character. Ultimately, the paradox of the speed of life teaches us that time, as we measure it, is only part of the story. The true essence of time lies in how we live it and in the intensity of our experiences. Although the years may pass more quickly as we grow older, each stage of life has its own rhythm and meaning, and what truly matters is how we fill those moments with experiences that although they may seem fleeting, leave indelible marks on our memory. This paradox invites us to value every instant and to seek novelty in the everyday, reminding us that the perception of time is as flexible and mysterious as life itself, and that the richness of our existence lies in the quality of the memories and emotions we accumulate along the way. The paradox of the interconnected world is a striking reflection on how, in the era of hyperconnectivity, in which social networks and globalization allow us to be in constant contact with people from every corner of the planet, many people feel increasingly lonely and disconnected. It is paradoxical that, despite having tools that allow us to communicate instantly and share every detail of our lives, loneliness and emotional isolation have become frequent problems in modern society. In a world where we can literally know what is happening anywhere with just a click, the feeling of isolation is intensified because digital communication, although undeniably useful, often fails to replace the value and depth of face-to-face interaction. Digital platforms have created an environment in which the number of connections is often confused with the quality of relationships. And while likes, comments, and posts offer a quick way to validate our experiences, they do not always satisfy the human need for genuine connection and empathy. This paradox is evident in the way that despite having hundreds or even thousands of friends online, many people experience feelings of loneliness and disconnection. The overabundance of information and the constant exposure to images of perfect and seemingly happy lives can generate a sense of inadequacy and isolation as a constant comparison is created between personal reality and the idealized image spread on the internet. In addition, digital communication tends to be superficial, with interactions that, although frequent, lack the intimacy and emotional depth achieved through in-person encounters. In this sense, the technology that should be a bridge to connect people sometimes acts as a wall that separates us, preventing the development of meaningful relationships and leaving many with the feeling of being nothing more than numbers in a global network. Another factor that contributes to this paradox is the fast pace of modern life, where information overload and constant digital connection can be overwhelming. The immediacy of responses and the availability 24/7 create an environment of constant pressure in which the quality of shared time is sacrificed in favor of the quantity of superficial interactions. Life, increasingly mediated by screens and devices, prevents us from enjoying moments of reflection and real presence with others, which in the long run intensifies the feeling of loneliness. The paradox becomes even more evident when we consider that although technology allows us to meet people from all over the world, it can also fragment our local communities and weaken the social fabric built through direct human contact. This situation invites us to rethink the meaning of connectivity. It is not simply about increasing the number of contacts on social networks, but about seeking authentic relationships that enrich our emotional lives and allow us to feel truly understood and supported. Technology should be seen as a tool to enhance human connection, but it is necessary to learn how to use it in a balanced way without sacrificing the value of face-to-face interactions. The paradox of the interconnected world challenges us to find a balance between the digital world and the real one, to disconnect in order to reconnect with ourselves and with the people around us, and to remember that the quality of relationships is not measured by the number of connections, but by the depth and sincerity with which moments are shared. Ultimately, this paradox teaches us that technological progress does not by itself guarantee an improvement in quality of life, but rather depends on how we use these tools to foster meaningful bonds. True human connection requires attention, empathy, and time, elements that cannot be replaced by notifications or instant messages. By recognizing the paradox of the interconnected world, we can begin to value authenticity in our relationships and seek ways to balance digital life with personal contact, building a future in which technology serves to unite us rather than isolate us. In the end, the more we advance in the era of connectivity, the more important it becomes to remember that the true value of communication lies in the quality of human encounters and in the ability to feel part of a community rather than simply being part of a vast and cold digital network.